Welcome, friends, to this installment in our ongoing exploration of the history of the popes. Today we turn our attention to a figure who, though his time on the chair of Peter was remarkably brief, nevertheless managed to leave a mark on the evolving relationship between the Roman See and the imperial power that still loomed over it in the late 7th century. I speak of Pope Benedict II, who governed the Church from late June of 684 until his death in May of 685. Benedict was a Roman through and through, the son of a man named John. From his youth he had been formed in the Schola Cantorum, that venerable school in Rome, where young clerics were trained not only in the sacred chant, but in the scriptures and the liturgical life of the city. He distinguished himself early on by his deep knowledge of the sacred texts and by the beauty of his singing voice. A reminder that, in those centuries, the liturgy was not simply a backdrop to church life, but one of its most expressive elements. As a priest, he was known above all for his humility, his love of the poor, and a generosity that seems to have been instinctive rather than calculated. When Pope Leo II died in the summer of 683, the clergy and people of Rome chose Benedict as his successor without undue delay. Yet here we encounter one of the characteristic tensions of the era. The election was not enough. Confirmation by the Byzantine emperor was still required, a practice that had become standard in the wake of the imperial exarchate and the political realities of an Italy still nominally under Constantinople. The delay this time was unusually long. Nearly 11 months passed between the election and Benedict's consecration on June 26, 684. The vacancy itself had been lengthy, and now this further wait underscored how vulnerable the Roman Church remained to the rhythms and whims of distant imperial authority. That experience appears to have sharpened Benedict's determination to ease the burden such delays placed on the Church. He entered into correspondence with Emperor Constantine IV Pogonatus, a ruler who, it should be said, had already shown himself more cooperative than some of his predecessors. Constantine had presided over the Sixth Ecumenical Council only a few years earlier, the council that definitively condemned monothelitism and reaffirmed the orthodox teaching on the two wills and two operations in Christ. The emperor's response to Benedict was favorable. He issued a decree that modified the procedure for papal confirmations. Historians still debate the precise terms, whether the requirement of direct imperial ratification was abolished altogether or simply delegated to the exarch in Ravenna so that it could be obtained locally and more swiftly. But the effect was the same. The long, disruptive vacancies that so often followed a pope's death were made less likely. In the delicate dance between spiritual authority and temporal power that defined so much of this period, Benedict achieved a small but meaningful adjustment, one that tilted just a little more autonomy toward the Roman See. Another gesture from this pontificate speaks volumes about the diplomatic and symbolic language of the time. Constantine sent locks of hair from his two young sons, Justinian and Heraclius, to Rome. Benedict received them and, in a ritual of spiritual adoption common in the early Middle Ages, took the boys under his protection as a kind of compater or co-father. It was a bond of affection and alliance, a way of knitting the imperial family more closely to the Church at Rome, and not incidentally reinforcing the Pope's moral standing in the eyes of the emperor. Benedict also continued the work of his immediate predecessors in consolidating the victory over monothelitism. He wrote to the bishops of Spain, urging them to subscribe formally to the decrees of the Sixth Council. He worked to secure the submission of Macarius, the deposed monothelite former bishop of Antioch, who had been a stubborn holdout. These efforts were part of a broader pattern in the late 7th century. The popes, having helped define orthodoxy at Constantinople, now sought to ensure its reception across the West, especially in the Visigothic kingdoms, where theological currents could still run strong and independent. Closer to home, Benedict showed himself a conscientious steward of the Roman churches. He restored several important basilicas, among them old St. Peter's itself, which had already begun to show the wear of time and use, and he supported the clergy, the deaconries that cared for the city's poor, and the lay sacristans who maintained the sacred spaces. These were not grand gestures of patronage on the scale of later centuries, but they reflect the pastoral heart of a man who had spent his life in the service of the liturgy and the needy. And then, quite suddenly, it was over. Benedict died on May 8th, 685, after only 11 months as Bishop of Rome. He was buried in St. Peter's, as had become customary, and his memory was honoured as that of a saint, with his feast kept on May 7th or 8th in different calendars. What are we to make of so short a pontificate? In one sense, it is easy to pass over Benedict II as a minor figure, a name on the list between Leo II and John V. Yet in another sense, his brief tenure captures something essential about the papacy in this transitional age. The Church was still negotiating its place in a world dominated by the Byzantine emperor. Yet the very fact that Benedict could secure even a modest reform in the confirmation process shows that the popes were not simply passive recipients of imperial favour. They were learning to use diplomacy, persistence, and the moral weight of their office to carve out greater freedom for the spiritual governance of the Church. Moreover, Benedict reminds us that sanctity and administrative competence are not mutually exclusive. His early training in the Schola Cantorum, his care for the poor, his attention to the fabric of Rome's churches, these were the quiet, steady virtues of a man who understood that the Church lives not only in great councils and dramatic confrontations, but in the daily fidelity of its ministers. In the long arc of the papal story, Benedict II occupies a modest place, yet it is precisely such modest places that often reveal the deeper currents at work. He bridged the era of the great Christological struggles and the emerging medieval world, where the popes would gradually assert a more independent voice. His achievement was small, but it was real, and in the history of the popes, small achievements, patiently won, often prove more enduring than the spectacular ones. Thank you for joining me today as we reflect on this quiet, faithful servant of the Church. Until next time, when we shall meet another of Peter's successors.